Mike check. What do you say about the accusations that you were too old school thinking of professional wrestling? You were into logical pure wrestling, but the product was dull and not crowned with success, while the trashy attitude era under Russo was one of the most successful.
Well, see, gosh, how do we even start answering this? Well, first of all, when he said you wanted stuff to make sense, right there, right off the bat, I got a problem with that question. Yeah. I was old school in that I have been for the last 15 years or so the guy that wanted to do old school, logical, credible professional wrestling with young guys. I wanted to do 80s style of wrestling with guys that were born in the 80s. Everybody else either wanted to rehash the same guys and put, guys that were in their 50s in the ring in main event pay-per-view matches with, they have artificial body parts and they're 50 something years old and they're as old as the fathers, in some cases the grandfathers of the current audience. But because they had big names in the past, that would be like trying to put Muhammad Ali in the ring right now. Because if you ask anybody in the world, name a boxer, the first person they're going to name is Muhammad Ali. That doesn't mean he ought to be fighting right now. Or you had people who wanted to do this, hokey sports entertainment, tomfoolery, attitude era, crash TV nonsense that ended up, as we saw what happened, hurting the business after it helped it. Because it's been this way in professional wrestling, and this is one of the things that fans don't understand because they haven't been involved in the business, and it's not their fault. But every period of what we used to call hot-shotting, in other words, when your business was down in a territory, you did everything you could to get it up. You did wild matches and brawls, and you had blood, and you had weapons, and you had violence, and you just did everything you could to throw it out there to see if you could get business up. And then the smart promoters, once business was up, would gear that back because you couldn't just continue to give them blood and guts and violence and chaos on a regular basis, or people became immune to it and then your business went back down. Mm-hmm. So the smart promoters were the ones who knew when to pull back. Well, Vince Russo, obviously nobody's ever accused him of being a smart promoter or booker. Nobody's ever accused him of that. He didn't know when to pull back. He just thought that's what people wanted. So he floored it. He floored the engine until until you blew a rod. He did everything every week, constantly, year after year after year. Well, I say year after year. It was like a 3-year period. And unfortunately, what happened then was people were immune to all that and expected it to be topped. And what happens after every period of hot-shotting in the wrestling industry over the past 100 years, if you hot-shot too long, you are followed by an equally long, if not longer, down period. Yes. And that's what I kept trying to explain to Mr. Russo that he couldn't believe because he thought he was so brilliant and intelligent that I asked him one time, I said, what are you going to do when business goes down? He said, if we're smart, it'll never go down. Think about that for a second. It'll never go down if we're smart. Well, there's a lot of smart people in a lot of smart fields. The stock market always goes down. I don't care how hot a business is, what the greatest ratings are for the biggest rated television program. Everything goes down. Entertainment is always cyclical, and everything always goes down and then goes up and goes down. Yes. But the Attitude Era, and he can't even take all the credit for that because at the same time as he was doing, midgets fucking in garbage cans and transvestite blowjobs and etc., you also had the ascension at the same time of not only the two biggest stars of the era, but the two biggest box office attractions in the history of wrestling of over 100 years, The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin. And my consideration is that people watched The Rock, they watched Steve Austin, and they watched the greatest heel character in modern wrestling, Mr. McMahon, and they didn't give a shit what was going on underneath because they were going to watch them regardless because they were fucking megastars. And so while Russo was, booking all this garbage underneath, basically once that they turned Steve Austin heel, which was a drastic mistake, And a lot of people lost faith for a while, and Rock went to Hollywood to make movies, and the Mr. McMahon character got a little long in the tooth, because how long can you, no matter how great the character is, how long can you like an evil boss before you're ready for something new? Basically, Russo left the business worse than what he found it, because it's never been that big since. Can anybody disagree with that?
No.
No, and Russo went to book WCW and tried to do the same thing, but he didn't have The Rock, and he didn't have Steve Austin, he didn't have Mr. McMahon, and they were out of business in 2 years and lost more money than any wrestling promotion in history. Russo then went on to spend most of the first 10 years of TNA booking TNA, and we see where they're at. They're practically having a garage sale to raise money to do a television taping. So history has borne me out that not only is every period of hot-shotting followed by an equally long or longer drought period, but also if it hadn't been for the serendipitous fact that he had the two biggest stars in the history of wrestling and a great heel character for them to play off of, Vince Russo couldn't have booked goddamn Lassie in a pet shop. And that's the way I answer that question. So as far as me being old school, what are people crying out for right now? What are the wrestling fans crying out for right now? Why don't they make sense with their storylines? Why don't they use talent better instead of trying to keep them down and just continue to recycle the same old guys on top? These are the two things that I've been ranting about for 15 years. Make the shit make sense so people can follow it. Don't go too far so you immune people to angles and to injuries. And don't recycle the same old names on top. And son of a gun... That's the three things that now the fans are going, well, why the fuck? Only I saw it earlier because I follow this shit.
Yeah, that's a big problem for our German fans as well.
So, if anybody wants to argue with that, I'd be more than happy to argue with them, but I think that history has now somewhat borne me out.
Yes, it's a big problem for our German fans as well. I read that often in the forums, that they're writing it lacks consistency, or that the wrong people are being pushed, or some other are not being pushed.
Start and stop pushes. The young guys don't get the chance to be, everybody wants to see Daniel Bryan succeed, but they keep him down because they can't. And hey, I helped train John Cena and I helped train Randy Orton, and they're two great talents. But they've also been on top now for 10 years. And how can we miss you if you won't go away? That's the whole problem. How can I miss you if you won't go away? In the old days, wrestlers traveled from territory to territory. No matter how popular you were in a given area, sooner or later people would get tired of you because they've seen it. So then you went away for a year and wrestled somewhere else. And when you came back, it was a big deal. Oh, we've missed you. We're glad you're back. How can I miss you if you won't go away? Now nobody goes away, because if they go away from the WWF, it's because they let them go away, because they don't sign them again, because they're useless, and they have no drawing power anymore because they've used it all up out of them.
Yeah, that's funny. That was actually my objection in our roundtable for the WWE TLC pay-per-view, where I said, wow, again, John Cena versus Randy Orton, we already had that in 2007, and now we have 2013.
Well, there you have it. And the problem is that, once again, and I don't want to ascribe all the blame to Russo, because everybody's had a hand in this fiasco, but Russo, what Russo did was he concentrated on the big name stars, but he actually did too much with everybody. He would book everybody on the roster in some angle or program or something. And to be honest, there's three different types of wrestlers. If you're a promoter and a booker, you want on your card. There's your main event stars that are the names that draw the money. There are the middle card stars that could go either way. They win enough, they can be in a main event every now and then, but they lose the big ones because they lose to the main event stars. And then the third group is people that just get their ass kicked, because somebody's got to get their ass kicked for somebody else to get over. Yep. What Russo tried to do was do programs and angles and storylines with everybody on the card to the point where people couldn't keep track of it unless they took notes. And as a result, it rendered what you did with your main event stars more meaningless, because the guy in the opening match was doing a program and an angle and a, et cetera, et cetera. And it was too much. You concentrate on your main event stars. You keep your middle card guys in good shape so they can go either way. And the guys on the bottom are there to get their ass kicked. And then they go away for a while somewhere else and they wrestle and they come back with a fresh gimmick. And then you can elevate them as AKA PJ Walker.
Yes. Okay, I wanted to know, how long have you been Booker and how much influence did you have on the Attitude Era?
I started booking, my first booking position was in 1989. Ric Flair became the booker of WCW because he was, quite frankly, very dissatisfied with the way the product was being presented after Turner Broadcasting bought the company. And since he was the biggest star, he demanded and received the booker position. And Kevin Sullivan was his assistant. And he asked me at the time if I wanted to join him. And of course I said yes. And I became the junior assistant at that point and was on the booking committee for about 6 or 8 months until Flair resigned because of Jim Herd's constant interference in his booking. And you can find the complete story in my book, the Jim Cornette and Midnight Express 25th Anniversary Scrapbook, which is available at jimcornette.com. But after Flair resigned, I tried to stick it out, but working with Jim Herd was just impossible. And so I quit a couple months later. And then when I started Smoky Mountain Wrestling, I was the booker for the 4 years of that run. Then when I had to close Smoky Mountain down because it was the wrestling recession of 1995, and even Vince McMahon lost $6 million that year, so you can imagine we were not doing that well. I got a position on the WWEF at the time creative team, which I held for 2 years until I literally could not coexist in the same room with Vince Russo anymore without going to prison. And at the time, Vince McMahon was buying into Russo's hoo-ha because he was getting his ass kicked in the ratings by WCW. So one of us had to go, and it was me. And then that was at the end of 1997. In June of 1999, I moved back to Louisville and took the book of Ohio Valley Wrestling and booked that single-handedly for 6 years. So I figured up one time, Paul Heyman and I are probably the two living humans that have booked the most wrestling television, live events, and pay-per-views over the past 15 years. And I did that for 6 years. Then I took a break for a little while and then was an agent, wasn't involved in a creative position, was the senior agent for TNA from 2006 to 2009 until once again Russo managed to sell Dixie Carter on the idea that he knew what he was doing. And after she got rid of Jeff Jarrett, he managed to get rid of me and Dutch Mantell. And then, of course, Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff came in a month later and got rid of him, basically. And then I was never the booker of Ring of Honor, but I assisted Adam Pearce first and then Delirious with the creative in Ring of Honor from 2009 until last year, at which case I realized that wrestling was making me a crazy person and the cause was pretty much lost, and I retired from the business in a participatory aspect, and I have for the last year been in the business of booking Jim Cornette, and I find myself a much easier person to deal with than most of the people that I've dealt with in the past.
You think so?
Hey, I'm easy for me to deal with. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm not really worried about them at this point. Yeah.
You having some Sprite at the moment?
Having a delicious glass of Sprite Zero, since I've been on a diet for the last year trying to get healthier, and I have lost about 50 pounds and have no stress in my life because I have no current wrestling in my life.
Well then, let's go to the next question. Anonymous is asking, what do you think? Why was there a Brawl for All in WWF? Was it to put all those wrestlers who didn't have a spot back in the day back into the spotlight? And why did they call it Brawl for All, which was somehow confusing since there was a Brawl for All before that wasn't a shoot? And what happened to the single people in there?
This was
I know how you think about that.
Yeah, well, and here's the thing. This was the answer to the question. Somebody asked me one time, what's the stupidest thing Vince McMahon has ever done? And for anything that anybody can say about Vince McMahon, he's not stupid. He is alternately a genius and batshit crazy at various points in time, but he's never been stupid. But this is the stupidest thing he has ever done because he allowed it to happen in his company and on his television. Vince Russo, to quote Bill Watts, if he was ever to be found in a men's locker room, he'd be whistling Stranger in Paradise. He's never been an athlete. He's never been involved in real athletics. I think he likes the New York baseball teams or whatever because he's from New York, but he's never been involved to the point where even when he was writing the television in the WWE or in TNA, he would never agent the matches that he wrote because he would tell the wrestling agents, well, I don't know anything about the physical stuff, so you guys just handle that, which was a problem enough. But he came up with this stupid idea that because we had a number of tough individuals on the roster, that we should have a shoot tournament and give the guys legitimate prize money, not wrestling fictitious prize money, but legitimate prize money, and see who would win, and people would tune in because it was real. And I told him, I said, let me get this straight. For the past couple of years, you have been beating the fans over the head with the idea that this is all entertainment. It's sports entertainment. Everything we do is contrived and predetermined and choreographed and scripted and whatever else. Because Russo had to, he had to have the fans know that it was scripted because elsewise he got no recognition. Because all the bookers in the history of wrestling that were wrestlers didn't want people to know they were bookers, because then that would, involve telling people wrestling was predetermined. They just wanted to be recognized as wrestlers, not as bookers. But Russo had no ability to be on camera, even though he put himself on such. He had no ability to be on camera. He had no ability to be a performer. So he wanted the fans to know that it was scripted because then he'd get some recognition. But in this case, he comes up with this idea to have a real tournament, kind of under semi-tough man rules where guys would wear gloves because we can't have bare-knuckle punches, but at the same time you could take people down, even though how can you take people down when you're wearing fucking gloves? He didn't know the UFC was hot on pay-per-view the first time, back when it was an outlaw organization, and we're talking Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock and legitimate athletes, and they were making some noise on pay-per-view. So for all these reasons, Russo decides to come up with a real tournament and call it Brawl for All and have the guys really fight. And I said, so that's what I said. Let me get this straight. For a couple of years now, you've been beating people over the head with the fact that what we do is choreographed and predetermined and that it's all phony. And now you're going to have, now that they believe you finally, you're going to have the guys go out and really fight each other and really hurt each other, and nobody's going to believe it. I said, what the fuck? So they did that.
And many people got injured.
And many people got injured. Imagine that. Who could have foreseen that many people would get injured? Because you had tough guys and guys that had backgrounds in Godfather, Kama Mustafa, Charles Wright, Papa Shango, whatever name you want to call him. He had a martial arts background and a little bit of a boxing background, but he was years, maybe a decade removed from training for competition. And see, that's another thing that Russo didn't understand. There's a difference between training for performance and training for competition. And you had Dan Severn actually was at the time was involved in the WWF, and he entered it and won his first round fight and then pulled out of it because he realized with the ridiculous rules and the fact that nobody in the thing really knows what they're doing, he could potentially, as a former UFC champion and still to this day the most decorated amateur wrestling athlete that the United States has ever produced, with over 100 national, regional, and local wrestling championships, plus being a UFC Hall of Famer. He could destroy his reputation even if he won this thing by having these stinky fucking fights. So he pulled out of it. You had Bob Holly in there, who's a tough son of a gun from Alabama, but didn't have any, besides in the bars, real fighting experience. You had Bart Gunn, who was a preliminary guy at the time, who did have a tough man fighting background and knew a little bit about boxing and had a wicked left hook. And The reason why some people went along with this was because Dr. Death Steve Williams had just joined the WWF, and everybody in the wrestling industry knew that Dr. Death Steve Williams, besides being a four-time, probably the only four-time NCAA All-American football player and wrestler ever to come from the state of Oklahoma, and imagine what territory that takes in, but also was one of the strongest and one of the toughest guys, was undefeated in any type of bar fight, was just physically one of the toughest sumbitches in the world. They thought, well, if he wins, then he can fight Steve Austin for the WWF title, and we've got some money, right? And all odds were on Dr. Death Steve Williams to win the thing, because nobody legitimately in the wrestling business, I saw him back, Road Warrior Hawk down one time in the locker room. So nobody thought that Dr. Death was going to get beat. But anyway, a bunch of guys got hurt, whether it be, from being knocked out or whether it be from tearing muscles, because none of these guys had been training for competition. This thing was sprung on them. And as I said, Russo, being completely illiterate as far as real athletics goes, didn't know the difference. So what happened was, in the match between Dr. Death and Bart Gunn, Doc tore his hamstring. The muscle in your leg that basically provides you with mobility in your thigh. So basically, in the process of this real fight with Bart Gunn, Doc tore his hamstring and became a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest, and still came out for the third round, but was immobile, couldn't move, and as a result got tagged by Bart Gunn's incredible left hand and got knocked out.
Yep.
Bart Gunn won the Brawl for All. Dr. Death Steve Williams' WWF career was basically finished because a guy that had been presented as pretty much a preliminary wrestler beat Dr. Death Steve Williams. And I went up to Russo afterwards and I said, how do you appreciate that? How do you like that now that you just cost the company $5 million in one night, you fucking idiot? Because that was the money that they could have made on pay-per-view with one Steve Austin and Steve Williams match. But now it would never happen because Steve Williams had been beaten by a preliminary guy. So Russo cost the company $5 million in one night. And then Bart Gunn, who was a great guy and a tough guy and a good worker, but one of those guys that if there were 500 spots, he would have had a steady living, but there were only 100, and he just didn't have the charisma and didn't have the oomph to get over. Ended up not getting over because he beat Steve Williams, because they put him in the ring with Butterbean, who was a gimmick boxer at WrestleMania, who looked like a human waterbed and was 350 pounds, but who had tremendous boxing and tough man experience. And Butterbean, a guy from outside our business, knocked Bart Gunn out in 1 minute and finished Bart Gunn off. So Vince Russo's great idea for the Brawl for All injured several guys on the roster, left a bunch of them with hard feelings, destroyed Dr. Death Steve Williams' WWF career, cost the company $5 million in one night, and put an end to Bart Gunn's wrestling career also, because after you get beat up and knocked out in a minute by a fat fucking boxer that nobody took seriously, where are you going to go from there? So that's an example of Vince Russo's brilliant idea, the Brawl for All. Yep. And I told him at the start and I told him at the finish, you're a fucking idiot and this is going to be a disaster. And son of a gun, wouldn't you know, it was.
Yes. I remember that back then. I thought, and I was 18 years old back then, I thought it just didn't make sense. At some point, some people are winning, but somehow not advancing in the tournament. Whether it is because someone pulled out or could not compete because of an injury wasn't actually explained to the viewer. Only Dan Severn explained why he pulled out. So it didn't make sense to the viewer to let the loser advance. Because
Dan Severn won and then pulled out because he saw where this was going, and he said, under these stupid rules that are contested nowhere else in sports, I am going to ruin my reputation in mixed martial arts if somebody catches me with a lucky punch, or if just something happens, and it's going to destroy my reputation. So he pulled out. And a couple other people had to pull out because even though they won, they got hurt to the point where that they couldn't continue.
Yeah.
And so then they just put the losers through, and it was a fucking fiasco from day one. And all of these things were easily predictable by somebody that knew either A, professional wrestling, or B, competitive combat sports. and Vince Russo was neither of those, and I was both of those. But at the time, it was fashionable to listen to Vince Russo, and also at the time, there were actually no other UFC and mixed martial arts fans in the office in the WWF because it was a brand new thing, and I just happened to have been in on it because Dan Severn had worked for me in Smoky Mountain Wrestling a few years beforehand, and we had done advertising with the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and I was kind of studying what was going on with that because I saw that we had a competitor that was presenting real fighting in a pro wrestling promotional kind of way, and I said, this is going to be our competition because as we get sillier, they get more serious, and they're using wrestling tricks and son of a gun. That was in 1994 when I first became aware of them, and 20 years later, the most successful pro wrestling promotion in the world is now the UFC, and Dana White is the most successful pro wrestling promoter in the world.
Yes.
And I wish somebody 20 years ago could have predicted that, and maybe we could have done something to stop them taking all our business away. Oh, wait a minute. I did predict it, and I asked people to do something about it, and they didn't pay attention to me.
Yeah. That was mainly the problem, I think. I remember.
And, I hate to sound like an obnoxious and egotistical prick, but you can actually go back through my interviews over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
All of these things that I am saying today, I have been saying, and nobody would listen to me. And now all of a sudden, everybody say, well, you know what? You're right. Well, yeah. I am right because that's what happened, and I've been right for 20 years, and I'm not proud of being right because it's led to the downfall of the wrestling business. But hey, you can only tell somebody so long something's going to happen, and they don't listen to you, and then you go, all right, we'll just wait and see, motherfucker.
So it's a curse.
I guess I don't know. It just people in this business for some reason think that they have to reinvent the wheel and they have to change shit that has worked for 100 years. And, I know everything has to evolve, but once again, that goes back to the old school question. Things evolve by coming up with new talent and new faces and guys with new ideas of how to present themselves. But the basic rules of football, basketball, baseball, soccer, which they, of course, in your part of the world, they call football, but whether it be American football, European football, whatever, boxing, the same rules of all sports still apply except for wrestling. They've decided we got to change wrestling because we got to evolve with the times. You evolve with the times by coming up with new and charismatic stars to play your sport, not by changing the goddamn sport. We don't do the inbounds, fucking pass in basketball across a flaming table. We don't do, you don't punt in football on the fourth down across a roll of barbed wire. You don't change the rules of the sport it's in a significant way. You polish them, but you come up with new and charismatic stars to play those sports. What we've done is we've just changed the whole goddamn sport and tried to make the stars fit. And as a result, it doesn't resemble what it did 20 years ago, which is now why when I talk to wrestling fans at non-wrestling events, at comic book conventions and sci-fi and horror movie conventions, and on my podcast, The Jim Cornette Experience at MLW.com, and all of these things, a lot of people say, more people, as a matter of fact, than follow wrestling now, say, I used to watch wrestling, but I don't anymore because it's gotten so silly, contrived, choreographed, phony, soap opera, fake, boring, talky, or whatever word they use. We've run off the wrestling fans. There are sports entertainment fans now, but they are unfortunately not as numerous as the ones we had in the 90s and 80s and 70s and 60s and 50s. There's never been a time where fewer people were actively interested in pro wrestling than there is today, and it's a result of changing the shit they liked about it to begin with, and various mismanagement by people outside our profession that have gained positions of power in it.
Well, and mainstream fans are mostly not watching the product constantly.
Yeah, if I owned a restaurant and a bunch of people came in and said, I really don't like your food. I liked your food last year. I don't like your food now. Why did you change your recipe? if more of those people came in and said they liked my recipes from last year than they do now, than the ones that are ordering my food now, I'd change my fucking recipes back.
Yeah.
You know, unfortunately, the WWE has more money than the federal government, and they do what they want to do. And every other wrestling promotion in the world tries to copy the WWE because they're the industry leader, and nobody does anything different. And therefore it leads to knee.
I remember WrestleMania 15 when Bart Gunn was fighting Butterbean, and I was at school, and people who were actually watching that match were saying, look, those wrestlers are all phony and wimps, because if a real boxer steps between those ropes, they'll punch them out in less than a second.
Yeah, and that actually proved, and I kept screaming at the time, because I was like, why are we doing this? The WWF, they have always wanted to be more than wrestling. And whether it's Kevin Dunn, the idiot executive producer of the television, or whoever it is, they've always wanted to be more than wrestling, instead of just being happy with being the biggest wrestling promotion. And they're just queer, as they say, for these celebrities to come in from, even if they're quasi-celebrities, to come in and lend their product some validity, quote unquote. And everybody knows now, with the rise of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, but everybody has always known in our profession, a great boxer can't last minutes with a great wrestler. If you're not boxing. If you're boxing, the boxer's going to knock anybody out. If you're wrestling, or if you're open to, if you're using MMA rules, then a wrestler is going to beat a striker almost every time unless they get a lucky punch. He's going to take him down. He's going to submit him. He's going to tie him up. He's going to wear him out. Down through history, any shoot fight between a wrestler and a boxer that was not predetermined has ended with a wrestler eating a boxer's lunch. That's the way it is. I'm sorry, and boxing fans can cry about it if they want to, but if they don't agree with me, then unfortunately they don't know what they're talking about, because it's been proven. And now it's proven regularly in the UFC that a great striker has what they call a puncher's chance, but a wrestler will stretch a boxer from here to goddamn Russia any day of the week. But when you put an experienced boxer in with a guy that's fought in, mid-level tough man contests and was not ever a competitive high-level amateur wrestler, you get what you got with Butterbean and Bart Gunn, which is the boxer's going to win, and then everybody goes, "Oh, I told you so," and it just fucking drives me out of my mind. That was a mainstream show that proved a point that's almost unprovable, that a boxer can beat a wrestler. Yeah. It's almost impossible to prove that a boxer can beat a wrestler, and they did it on a wrestling show.
Okay, the next.
We better make the next one the last one, because I've got to start getting to my podcast as it's Christmas season. But Gordon, I've enjoyed talking to you so much. I'd be glad to do part 2 sometime. Give me a good one to go out on.
Okay, Alex Maeda is asking, Mr. Cornette, would you win in a Vince McMahon imitation contest against The Big Show?
No. I will not win anything against The Big Show. I love The Big Show. He's a good friend of mine, and I think he could probably do Vince better than me. Because he doesn't have a Southern accent, and neither does Vince, and I would do Vince with a Southern accent.
Okay. We would have 2 more questions about WWF.
Let's go to it. There you go.
Okay. Kitano Yama, did WWF make the right decision in changing from Attitude Era to PG Era? Do you see any signs to which side the pendulum might swing, even more to PG or back to an adult-based promotion?
Well, did they make the right decision? Yes, they made the right decision, not in terms of the quality of their product, but in terms of the quality of their business. They made the right decision. Because once again, I have to go back to my friend Vince Russo in the Attitude Era. For a long time, pro wrestling did bad taste in good taste. You had to be a little questionable in professional wrestling to get people's attention and to get them fired up, because pro wrestling played on emotions, and you want to make people mad, or you want to get people behind the hero by making them mad at the villain. But at the same time, always the pro wrestling promoters were conscious that if they went too far, they could lose their television. The TV station could say, we can't air this. And once you lose your TV, then you're shit out of luck and you're done. So they always skirted that fine line, and you couldn't curse, and you couldn't go too sexual, and you couldn't do certain things that in certain places that would be hot button things that the promoters knew would get them kicked off television. Well, when Vince McMahon was suddenly on the losing side of the ratings war with WCW, because WCW was spending money like a drunken sailor under Eric Bischoff and signing up all the stars that Vince had made and doing things edgier. He had to get edgy in turn. And of course, then he listened to Vince Russo, and we've already covered hot shotting. But also what that did was it made a lot of people while it made a lot of people watch wrestling, because, hey, if you drive down the road and you see two dogs fucking on the side of the road, you're going to slow down and you're going to watch. You're going, hey, look at those two dogs, right? But if you drive down the road the next day and the same two dogs in the same place are fucking again, you're going to go, oh, they're doing it again. A week of that, and you're going to drive right by and not even pay attention, right? Because you've seen it every day. Yeah. Every day, you know, when you go by there, those dogs are going to be fucking. Well, Vince Russo led to the dogs fucking on the side of the road every day, to the point where a lot of people didn't pay attention, but the ones that did pay attention were the parents that didn't want their kids watching these transvestites and these boobies hanging out and this cursing and giving the finger and grabbing the crotch. So there was a backlash among advertisers who didn't want to be involved in necrophilia angles. You know, if you're Coca-Cola, you know, you're a big-time company. You don't want to be sponsoring a program that has transvestite blowjobs and necrophilia, so you stay away. So they started having blowback from their advertisers. So then they had to swing the pendulum all the other way. Oh, now we're going to be nice. We're going to be PG, and you can't choke a guy with your necktie, and you can't do this, you can't do that. And as a result, they've made a certain amount of fans who want to see all this chaos and mayhem go on. So then they go all the way to the other way to PG rated. Now those fans are mad. And truthfully and honestly, the parents that didn't want their kids watching this stuff, they ain't going to watch the shit anyway because they didn't like it to begin with. But it's easier for the advertisers to buy into because they still get eyeballs. So they went from trying to get viewers by having two dogs fuck on the side of the road to not caring whether the viewers watched or not, as long as the goddamn advertisers were happy, which pissed the fans off. So now basically that's the price you pay for going to one extreme or another, instead of just going down the middle and providing a product and doing just what you can do and getting away with a few things here and there, but not going to excesses. Because excesses of any kind, either positive or negative, one side of the pendulum or the other, sooner or later will lead you to problems. So they made the right decision for business, probably not for the fans. I don't think they need to go back as far as the transvestite blowjobs, but I sure would like to see more people choked with neckties, because it's like when TBS, and in my book, The Midnight Express and Jim Cornette 25th Anniversary Scrapbook, you actually see a TBS memo reproduced where they were mad because when Terry Funk put the plastic bag over Ric Flair's head and tried to smother him, they sent out a memo basically saying that there would be no more gratuitous violence on the wrestling program. So a program about gratuitous violence was now prevented from having gratuitous violence involved in it. That's what's happened to pro wrestling. It's about the TV networks and the advertisers instead of what the fans want to see. They went too far. Now they got to pull it back too far. I don't ever see it going in the other direction, because now they're a publicly traded company. They're stockholders. They have to be more women friendly, even though in the 80s, when wrestling was violent and gritty and tough, and the NWA and the Rock and Roll Express was the hottest tag team, and the crowds were 60% women because they all wanted to fuck the Rock and Roll Express. Now wrestling crowds are, anywhere from Ring of Honor is 2 to 5% women, to the WWF, which there's some women because they like the hot guys, and a few mothers because they brought the kids, and it's probably 70% male, if not more. I don't ever see it going back to the Attitude Era, because you can't get away with that anymore, because now people are too touchy and you have to be politically correct. I don't ever see it going back to the way it used to be in the 80s, because to do that, you'd have to somehow try to make people believe wrestling is real again, and that horse has left the barn. So I think what we're stuck with on a mainstream basis is the WWE is going to be PG rated, and TNA is going to be a non-factor, and independent wrestling is going to get away with whatever independent wrestling gets away with, because nobody's watching it anyway. And that's the sad state of affairs, and that's probably a good place to wrap it up.
Mm. Yeah, it ain't a surprise if you know there's a surprise coming.
There you go. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I'll say this one thing, and I'll get off of here. Chris Candido, the only shot that I made for ECW, Chris Candido called me up. He said, Jim, Paul was wondering if you would make a shot for him. I said, why? After all the water under the bridge between me and Paulie, would he think that? Well, we're kind of stuck. We need a surprise. I said, what do you mean you need a surprise? we need a surprise for the ECW arena, because we have a surprise every show, and this show we don't have one. I said, Chris, the actual dictionary definition of a surprise is an unexpected occurrence. I said, if people are expecting a surprise, it can't be a surprise, can it? And he's like, well, it's kind of the situation we're in. I said, all right. And I made the deal, with Chris, that I would do it for free, for no money. All I wanted Paulie to do was shake hands with my old friend Dennis Corluzzo for the way he fucked him in the NWA Championship tournament and embarrassed him in front of his friends and his business associates. And if he did that, I'd make the show. So we made that deal, and then Paulie got me a limo ride from Stamford, Connecticut, all the way to Philadelphia, bought me and Dennis Corluzzo dinner at Morton Steakhouse, which you have to take a credit application out to eat there, gave me $750 in cash I didn't ask for, and then didn't honor the agreement and didn't do the one thing that I asked him to do, which was make up with Dennis and trade talent with Dennis's promotions. So that was my one experience at ECW. But yeah, there you have it. An unexpected surprise. Gordon, it's been great. Listen, I will be glad to do this again sometime. I'm sorry I have to cut it short, but I didn't actually know that I was going to have to do my podcast on pre-tape today because of Court Bauer's vacation, and I got to turn around and get ready for that. But I will be glad to do part 2 sometime upcoming in the near future.
Yes, we can. That's great.
Okay.
Mr. Cornette, it was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. I appreciate it very much.